So, Jake, I'm very happy to have you here, and it'll be fun to talk a little bit about a theme which is, I think, really central to both of our interests and curiosity, and is also very much tied to what Aspen's doing here with the climate conference. And that's the theme of nature and how human beings actually relate to it in a very honest and direct way. And I suppose in both of our cases, there's like a kind of very intimate human story behind that, which has to do with how much you and I both love nature and have had a lot of really clear experiences of that. So maybe we can both start there, just talking about what our own experiences of nature are like, and then we can kind of think about some of the larger questions that are facing us around that topic.
I love that as a way to open up the conversation, because I think oftentimes we start with our relationship to nature, and especially sort of ethical intuitions about our relationship to nature that are maybe not universal, and they can be felt as universal. Like we have these sort of ecological or green or nature a prioris that just sit there ahead of time, that we know how to relate to it. And it can be really helpful to start by asking, well, how do those get formed? And how do the diverse intuitions we have about our relationship and our responsibility to this world, how do those get shaped really over the course of a lifetime, sometimes over peak experiences and special episodes, events that happen to people. But in my own case, I think an enormous amount of my interests and passions here were shaped by spending my formative years growing up in Colorado, in the mountains at a pretty high elevation, 7,000 to 10,000 feet, depending on which of my family's, which period of my family's life it was. And I think that I can't overstate how much that shaped my feelings of responsibility for the world, and also my feelings of kinship with a world that isn't just limited to the human community, right? I mean, humans are obviously really important, and I'm not trying to downplay that community, but there's a sense of living with an animate and agential world that is taking an active part in shaping my own culture, my own experiences, my own memories, but also the collective experiences and memories that I was having with my friends and my family and things like that. And living in that environment, it was far harder to see it as a background against which things happened, as if it was just a room I happened to walk into. Yeah. Instead, it was taking the world, the land, and the creatures who happen to inhabit it, including, some that you don't want to provoke too much, like bears and mountain lions, the toothy ones. Yeah. But they were all taking an active part in shaping my, my adolescence, my young adulthood, I think sometimes starting by giving a narration of how did you come to have this relationship to the world, where did you think about it, it will oftentimes have those biographical elements. They have more than biographical significance, but they're biographically rooted. They're subjectively rooted.
I mean, I relate to a lot of that. And I guess one thing that I especially have valued I also grew up in the mountains. And I think one thing that remains very powerful in the kind of person that I became from that experience is how I deal with threat or risk. I remember these moments where you'd see like these, looking out my window when I was growing up, there are big 14,000 foot mountains right out the window, and seeing like big thunderstorms kind of rippling across the valley. Sure. And on the one hand, like for a little kid, like it's scary, like you know that it's going to be there in 15 minutes and it has this intensity to it. But on the other hand, it's obviously not bad. In fact, it's like the opposite. Like it's obviously beautiful and important, and like there's actually like a kind of piece to it that I think has stuck with me and has ended up shaping my own intuitions about how you relate to the sense of the world in general, which is there may be things that are threatening, but that doesn't mean that they're evil. Like that kind of, I think I never got that dichotomy in a basic sense.
I think that's that's how we make sense of otherness
Yeah.
at a fundamental scale.
Yeah.
And often we can feel otherness as threatening, even ugly,
Yeah.
because it doesn't fit into the confines of what I can expect and manage. And I think there's two fundamental relations we can have to that otherness, and these actually almost encode two fundamental relations that human beings can take to the natural world. I think my favorite. I'm sorry, I'm a professor, so I think about literary texts all the time. And one of my favorite illustrations of this is in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's *The Rime of the Ancient Mariner*, where it's this wonderfully haunting Gothic tale about a mariner who ends up killing an albatross and is then haunted by these horrible sort of demon things. But the pivotal moment of the book, spoiler alert, is when the mariner is able to see these things that he saw until then as absolutely repulsive. He saw them as these slimy sea snakes. And the change in the entire arc of the story is when he looks at them and he blesses them unaware and he sees their beauty. And there's a shift. And I think that shift is one from seeking to control a world to trusting in one's kinship with the world.
Yeah.
And that trust allows you to have a different relationship to otherness, which can then reveal its beauty, right? I mean, almost anything looked at closely enough, when we give it our attention, it shows itself as inexhaustible, and that inexhaustibility is gorgeous. If it's like, this is I had a student who told me once, she was an art student, and she said the fundamental thing she learned as an art student was that they'd bring in all these different bodies and have them begin to sketch them. And she said the fundamental thing she learned is that any body looked at with deep attention becomes beautiful. Right? And what can appear ugly at a surface glance, where you're giving it the difference between the doom scroll attention we give to our social media, where you're barely looking at something, and the attention of dropping into a reverent, trusting relationship with that which is in front of one, allows for everything to be to show itself in its beauty, and that elicits deeper moral relations to them.
I mean, so in certain ways, like your work teaching philosophy, my work running a philosophy research center at Aspen, are both, I think, trying to work through these questions of alienation and trust. And I'd be curious, so when you think about our relationship to nature at the moment and that sense of alienation, just like very quickly, like how do you trace, like what is the current state, like how's it going? Like,
how's it going?
As we think about how we're doing relating to nature, what's the state of affairs?
Well, I think as a culture, we in the sort of North Atlantic countries of the West are probably, I don't want to say that we are more alienated than humans have ever been from a relationship to the natural world, because there have been some pretty dismal episodes. I think the 14th century was particularly bad. But we experience an enormous degree of alienation that's really mediated through our social, economic, and technological structures, right? That we have not only systematically destroyed much of the world around us, like literally paved it, but we're training ourselves in habits of attention that keep us from relating well, I think, to one another, but also keep us from relating well to the more than human world that in which we live and move and have our being. And that more than human world, if we don't relate to it deeply, then and we don't give it that time and attention, then it's easy for us to think of our relationship to it in purely instrumental, extractive, objectifying terms.
Yeah. And how does the history of that? How do we get to this point?
Yeah, I mean, people tell lots of stories about how we got to that point. I think it's complex. In some ways, I think the idea of nature as corrupted by the supplement of culture goes back 2,500 years to Ovid and Hesiod with the Greeks, and we have various iterations of it in lots of different traditions. But it's always been juxtaposed with these deeper traditions that see our relationship to everything as articulate and intelligible, communal. Something
that there is a kind of reciprocity and responsibility. Like we may pull things from nature, we definitely are dependent on it in all kinds of ways, but there is also a sense of respect, like to use your word earlier, reverence, responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. So the way in which we in the West have tended to think about a relationship to nature is to see it as this well-ordered, moral, and biophysical whole, right?
Yeah.
To which I can have a relationship of I can preserve it, I can flee from it, I can defend it, I can cloister it, I can do these I can extract value from it.
Yeah.
But that tends to see nature and culture as these two different things that are just locked in that battle, right? Whereas I think a much richer understanding of both the idea of nature and of the idea of culture sees them as shot through with one another.
Yeah.
That the world, the natural world that we are in relationship to I want to say it has cultural components to it.
Yeah.
Even linguistic and historical components, and people working on biosemiotics and biomimicry and these various cutting edge fields right now are getting into a lot of this. But also our cultures are shot through with what we want to call nature. We're all born and have to grow and gestate, and we learn. I think we acquire the capacity to use intelligible words to speak about the world around us because the world is intelligible. It's one of the fundamentally most amazing things about the world is that it is intelligible and articulates itself.
When I think about like the current state of the ecological movement and where we are with these kinds of topics, it feels to me like our sights are actually much too low. So the kinds of things that you often get when you're in these conversations about climate change, the future of ecology, is very much like, how do we get like immediate policy in place to like essentially like get rid of the crisis, like make sure that we're no longer in this place where our use of energy is destroying the climate, and then we can get back to business as usual and go shopping. And like that feels to me like entirely the wrong frame. That like the lesson from where we are now is that how we've been living is somehow disjointed, and that has an effect externally on the natural world, but it feels like it also has like a very direct effect on us. Like somehow our lives are mixed up, distorted, not aligned in like a really important way. And so I guess I'm especially interested in the parts of the ecological movement that have to do with renovating our way of life. Like how do we live, and like what would a future of harmony of a different kind actually look like in a really basic sense? I don't know. Yeah, I imagine you touched on some of this.
Well, I mean, I don't want to denigrate the immediate efforts to construct policy-based solutions to halt devastating and extractive measures in the world. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
We need to engage in those immediate and also, decades-long policy thinking to begin to change some of our behaviors. But that policy conversation can often elide what I hear you describing, which is the deeper cultural, moral, and I even want to say spiritual transformation that a renewed relationship to the world and to nature would ask of us. I think one of the things that is bound up with this question is rediscovering our capacity to ask about the nature of what human beings are for. Is essential to our redressing this disordered, alienating relationship to nature in any deep sense. Right? We need to be able to not just assume that what I am is a desiring machine that's kind of thrown out into the world seeking to maximize its caloric intake while maintaining a nice physique, right?
Yeah.
It's that's
Yeah.
that's one model of what human flourishing looks like, but that's not I think the best or the most philosophically profound model, and it's certainly not the only model that we've had on option.
Yeah.
And so beginning to rethink those questions of what human flourishing means and how we could think of human flourishing as integrally bound up with the mutual flourishing of a world that consists of much more than just humans is, I think, one of the crucial tasks of a deep thinking about ecological issues. We need the policy-related solutions. We need the activists who are engaging in holding actions to try to stop certain things from going forward. You need those collective efforts, but also there has to be some place for what Hannah Arendt describes as the slow work of human beings in vulnerability to one another, trusting with one another, and trusting to voices that are more than human. And it's only in that place of vulnerable, trusting mutuality, the slow effort of understanding and relationship, that anything actually new could come about, right? Otherwise, we're running scripts that are preloaded with their outcomes, and you'll never get something new by running those ideal scripts. You have to enter into that place of vulnerability and trust for genuine novelty to be born. Arendt calls it actually natality. It's a beautiful image she has, but it's the birth of something new that's always in that vulnerable condition.
I mean, it's so interesting how there's like also a kind of feedback where the capacity for new imagination, which I mean, I fundamentally agree with you. I mean, I think one of the things I principally find in our work is just how stultified or status quo the kind of like broad discussion is. And that's true when we're talking about ecology. It's also true when we're talking about the future of democracy. It's also true when we're talking about the crisis of loneliness. It's also true when we're talking about poverty. Like in all of these cases, there's
mental
like
health crisis.
Yeah, exactly. Like in all of these cases, you have like very direct discussion about the state of the problems. And I think like that's good. I mean, I think that the searching way that our culture is recognizing its internal and external crises is like very positive. But then the capacity to engage with that and say like, no, we can actually envision a future. Like that feeling that we're not just going to be stuck within the kind of like gradually decaying systems that we're in. That seems very hard to achieve. And I guess I wonder whether the thing that you said at the beginning is like a kind of potential avenue through that, which is that sense of reverence. Like, my own experience is going for a long run in someplace beautiful. Immediately, like often, it's funny like how many times this has happened to me. Like I should expect it, but it often like hits me totally by surprise that I come out of an experience like that and I'm instantly nourished in a way that I didn't expect and couldn't have predicted. But then that itself ends up being the capacity for like significantly more ability to envision things that are bigger. And I do wonder a lot about that point of nourishment. Like how do you get to the point where there's something that can get into that visceral level that gives us like a larger aperture?
I mean, that's a tough question. If we have time, we can circle back to it. But I want to pick up on something you said there when you're talking about reverence, and you say that it gives you this feeling of nourishment that can produce new insight. And I think that's a really important claim. It's not just that reverence is a subjective feeling or a mood that I might or might not have to a world that's otherwise indifferent to the way that I relate to it. It's also the case that reverence can become a means of perception and even an order of cognition, an organ of cognition.
You're actually like experiencing something that's more real than you would be able to experience without it.
Right. The world is susceptible to being perceived in ways that only reverence will reveal to us. And that face of the world that can be perceived with reverence, with trust, discloses something about our real relationship to it, including these moral and political obligations to a world that otherwise we elide and we don't see. And so So the question becomes like, how do you shape
Yeah.
souls?
Yeah.
How do you shape persons that are capable of having those intuitions,
Yeah.
of entering into those relationships so that they see the moral stakes
Yeah.
beyond just the stultified and
Yeah.
sort of shallow stakes that a purely extractive consumerist
Yeah.
economy dictates.
I mean, it's a very surprisingly optimistic note to end on, given where we started with alienation and climate crisis. So, yeah, thank you very much, Jake.
Yeah.
It's really a pleasure to see you. And
Well, thanks
really enjoying this.
for inviting me to talk.
Yeah, yeah.